All right, everyone. Thanks for joining us. As I mentioned earlier, thank you for joining us for our webinar called Leveraging Nature-Based Solutions to Drive Down Greenhouse Gas Emissions with a focus on the corporate sector. I'm Verena Radulovic. I'm the Director of Corporate Engagement at the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. And for those of you that don't know us, C2ES is a nonpartisan, nonprofit research organization committed to advancing climate solutions and the technologies and policies to promote them. We catalyze business action through our growing Business Environmental Leadership Council, which is a group of Fortune 500 companies committed to addressing climate change. And we bring together these stakeholders of different perspectives and different sectors to build common ground, especially through our Climate Innovation 2050 initiative, which looks at ways to decarbonize our economy. So today, C2ES and our guests, we're grateful to have you here for a discussion on nature-based solutions to help companies achieve their ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets. On this webinar today, we're going to look at how companies can approach using nature-based solutions to reduce their emissions, including the most effective use of resources when investing in these solutions, understanding the role of carbon removals in reaching net zero emissions, which I know has been a hot topic of conversation of late, and really the criteria that companies should consider when selecting their projects. We're also going to look at how to leverage natural solutions, nature-based solutions to reduce emissions within and outside of a company's value chain. I'm also going to be asking our panelists where policy can help unlock more solutions so that more companies can add nature-based solutions to their suite of efforts to reduce their emissions and help advance a decarbonized economy. So I want to note there will be opportunities for the audience to ask questions throughout the webinar, and we'd like for this to be a dynamic conversation. So please use the question tab in your control panel to get those in, and we're going to do our best to address those throughout the webinar. The format for this is going to be kind of a more conversational. So while I'm speaking with each of the panelists, if you have a specific question for that panelist, please go ahead and ask it, and I'll do my best to get to it. Otherwise, we will save time towards the end for audience questions. This webinar is being recorded in full. The recording will be posted to our YouTube page within 24 hours, and you will receive a link to the recording in a follow-up email tomorrow. And finally, stay connected to us by following us on Twitter at C2ES_ORG for org. So with us today, I'd like to introduce our panelists first before we jump into the discussion. First, we'll be joined by Janet Peace, who is the Chief of Advisory Services at BlueSource, a large environmental projects developer in the United States that works with companies to help them reduce their climate impacts. And in that role, Janet leads guidance and engagement on key climate issues important to BlueSource clients, including policy, natural climate solutions, greenhouse gas inventories, carbon strategy, reporting, goal setting, and carbon neutrality. And for those of you who know Janet, you also know her as a former vice president here at C2ES. We're really happy to have her back with us. After Janet, we're going to hear from Shawn Patterson, who is the Vice President for Environmental Management and Safety at DTE Energy, which is a utility based in Michigan. In his role, Shawn is responsible for the strategic direction and execution of the company's environmental policies, sustainability initiatives, and workplace health and safety. His teams work with other DTE employees, government agencies, nonprofit groups, and others to drive enterprise-wide improvements for all of DTE's environmental and safety systems. And he's going to be talking about the work that DTE is doing and how they're leveraging nature-based solutions to drive down their footprint and those of their customers. After we speak with Shawn, we're going to hear from Roberta Barbieri, who is Vice President for Global Sustainability in her role at Pepsico. She's accountable for executing PepsiCo's environmental sustainability strategy and a specific responsibility for integrating sustainability into core business processes and delivering on PepsiCo's goals for climate and water stewardship. And last, but certainly not least, we hear from Kelley Kizzier, who is an Associate Vice President for International Climate at EDF, the Environmental Defense Fund. And in that role, Kelley leads EDF's work to promote ambitious and effective global climate action in a number of multilateral forums, most notably the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the International Maritime Organization. So a lot of different perspectives. Let's go ahead and dive in. Our panel is going to offer their perspectives and their experiences on how companies specifically can leverage nature-based solutions to meet their own climate goals. So with that, I'd like to start the conversation with you, Janet. We've got some slides up here, and we're going to spotlight Janet in a moment here. But Janet, I'd love for you to start by providing an overview of the different nature-based solutions in which companies are investing, and we can go from there.
Okay, terrific. And thanks for the kind introduction, Verena. It really is a pleasure to be back with old friends talking about what I think is a very hot topic these days. Um, so I'm going to address your question, and I also thought I'd do a little bit of the groundwork for the conversation. First you mentioned who BlueSource was. I'll add a couple things. Stephanie, if you want to turn to the next one, please. So we have been around about 20 years, even though I haven't been with the company that long. And we're really kind of a full service climate and energy company. We advise large companies and small companies. And our goal is really to make it easy to understand the various options, from internal reductions to the use of environmental markets. And as I said, they've been around about 20 years. And in fact, before I joined Pew and C2ES, I actually hired BlueSource to help create some methodologies for what was then the first climate program in Canada under the Prime Minister Chrétien. And since then, they've created more than 20 different methodologies for different technologies, over 200 projects, 85 locations, 46 states, 4 provinces in Canada. You could say they've been a little busy. And it's, in terms of the topic that we're going to address today, BlueSource manages the largest voluntary forest carbon portfolio in North America. So again, it's a great time to be working at BlueSource. It's a great time to be working on climate issues because policy is being created and expanded. The US is back in the Paris Agreement. Can I just say yay about that? And voluntary action is really accelerating at a pace that I would never have expected. In 2020 alone, the number of net zero commitments put out there actually doubled. And according to the UNFCCC website, more than 1,500 entities today, and that includes companies, universities, cities, et cetera, now have net zero goals. And I know a lot more are actually on the horizon. So I'm going to talk primarily about voluntary efforts because those are so important, but I don't want anybody to take away from this webinar that voluntary is a substitute for policy. It's definitely a complement. Government policy hopefully can harness the power of the market to drive investment, and voluntary markets can do the same. And we really need private sector investment in climate action to increase because government can't do it alone. So I thought maybe to lay that foundation, I'd illustrate a bit of a taxonomy of what offsets are. Next slide, please. So looking at this graph, this is an adaptation of a graphic that the Oxford Carbon Principles put out last September. And it should say source Oxford Climate Principles, September 2020. Sorry, it doesn't say that. Putting a value on activities that address climate and carbon is super important. And again, these net zero goals are part of that. And if you recall, the Paris Agreement says that we have to get to net zero by middle of the century, which means that we need to balance the amount of emissions in the atmosphere with what is actually stored. And so that means we have to do as much as possible to reduce emissions as well as store it. And so sinks are super important. And putting a value on, putting a value on sinks by the use of offsets is one way to incentivize the investment in sinks. And using nature-based offsets as part of a corporate strategy that includes those internal reductions, that includes investing in low carbon technology, is just part of what I think is driving a lot of action in the voluntary carbon market these days. But the subject of offsets, you can't read this slide. I'm sorry, and it's kind of in small print, but the point of it is that it's kind of complicated. There's basically 2 types of offsets out there. There are offsets that remove carbon from the atmosphere, and there are other types of offsets that are, that avoid emissions or that reduce emissions. And it gets kind of complicated. I mean, I get questions all the time, like, what are the best type of offsets to use? What kind of offsets are nature-based? What are the best ones that meet with my brand and my corporate image? So this slide gives you a little bit of that information. You can see the dark blue, those are the carbon removal types of projects, and the light blue are the emission reduction and avoidance types of projects. And so let's just talk about removal for a minute. So planting trees, afforestation and reforestation, adding amendments to soil carbon in agriculture, that increases the carbon absorption of the soil. Those remove CO2 from the atmosphere, but so do direct air capture with carbon storage. So does bioenergy with carbon storage. There's a few other ones on there, mineralization and enhanced weathering. This list is not exhaustive in any way, shape, or form. It's just a few illustrative ones. If you look on the light blue side, you'll also see biologic emission reductions that come from avoiding the damage to ecosystems, like protecting mangroves or improved forest carbon management, or changes to ag practices that retain stored carbon in the land, for example, protecting grasslands. But you also have those more mechanical type from carbon capture and storage, taking the CO2 off of a stack rather than the atmosphere, and then again storing them. Next slide. Next slide, please. There you go. So when people talk about nature-based offsets or nature-based solutions, they're most often talking about the two types in these green circles: the afforestation or reforestation, or adding stuff to soils, or avoiding the harvesting of trees, or changing ag practices. These are the basics of nature-based solutions. But I have to tell you that it's a little bit, even though I really like this graphic, it's a little bit confusing and it's not quite so black and white, because those in the light blue box, those avoiding damaged ecosystems, or protecting forests or protecting grasslands, those, as trees grow, they also remove CO2 from the atmosphere. So while I have just afforestation or reforestation in the dark blue, the light blue in the green circle, those also remove carbon in addition to storing it. It's in the lighter blue boxes, you have other types of projects too. You have landfill gas, you have clean air cook stoves, you have N2O abatement, and those are all important. All of these are good offsets when done right. I think it's important to realize that that all of them lead to an emission reduction or an emission avoidance or an emission removal. But there's a lot of attention these days on carbon removal. You'll see companies with targets like net negative or carbon positive. So they're often looking for these types of projects that remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. But they can also look at those in the light blue box as well, because those also remove. And I think from a buyer's perspective, it's also important to think about the other benefits that come from supporting a project. Are you supporting innovation? Are you supporting biodiversity? Are you supporting mitigation and climate resilience? A standing forest, for example, has more of an immediate ability to protect wildlife than, say, growing a forest does. And I really like the blog that WWF put out a while back that was, growing forests are great, but standing forests are better. I also think it's important to consider that growing trees just for carbon removal could result in more trees being grown that are quick growing, like, for example, hybrid poplars. And these may not have the habitat value that, say, a standing hardwood forest would. A recent academic paper from a lot of, there's a long list of authors, some from University of Georgia and P&L labs. They raised this issue of, does forest carbon impact biodiversity and habitat? And so they were really concerned about just reforesting with trees that grow fast, rather than keeping your eye on all of the environmental amenities that come from these different kinds of projects. Again, all of these are good project types, but today most of the emphasis and buyers are looking for nature-based offsets. And I think that's primarily because of so many of the amenity values, the habitat, the biodiversity that you get when you protect a forest, or when you add a soil amendment, or when you protect an ecosystem. Next slide, please. Verena also asked me to say something about what makes a good quality offset. And as I said, all those little categories in blue boxes and dark blue boxes can make good projects. And they all can deliver a high quality offset. They just have to be done right. And these are 6 criteria that you'll most often see mentioned: additional, verifiable, enforceable, real, is it permanent, does it address leakage? And I just have to say that all of these criteria are important, and we identified these a long time ago as part of the Offsets Quality Initiative that Pew was involved in. And the one that probably gets most attention with nature-based solutions or offsets is the permanence. And there are rules and requirements within the major voluntary registries for how to deal with permanence. There are, you put it in basically a buffer pool, which acts as kind of an overall insurance policy for offsets and nature-based offsets. And while I'm at it, these voluntary registries, they create the methodologies and include the requirements for how do you determine additionality, what's real. And each one of them also has stipulations for how do you address leakage. And so buying an offset from one of these voluntary registries is good because it really creates the methodology. They're transparent. Anybody can go in and look at those methodologies. And they also put the requirements on there that you have to have a third party verify what you're doing. So an offset developer can't just create a project and then say, oh, it's good enough. You have to have a third party come in and check your work, make sure that it conforms to the requirements according to the registry. And then the registries also ensure that a ton is not sold twice or double claimed. And they do that by giving serial numbers to each one of the projects and each one of the offset credits. So ensuring that you're buying from a reputable registry that does this is one way I think that can help buyers out there think about what kind of offsets they want to be looking for. But again, you want an offset that's going to meet with your brand identity and that's going to meet your needs. Next slide. Just a couple, I already mentioned a few things about where the market has gone so far. I want to really say that there's some pretty cool things that offsets are being used for. They're used for meeting goals and objectives, demonstrating good corporate responsibility. Other companies are using them to engage with their customers, with their clients, and they're even being used to demonstrate that an investment delivers a greenhouse gas benefit. In other words, making sure that your money actually made a difference and you're getting a greenhouse gas outcome. Today, there's about 14,500 credits that have been generated according to the World Bank. And more than half of those credits were generated under the Clean Development Mechanism of the Kyoto Protocol. And of all of those, forestry has issued the most credits. And I think, again, the reason for that and the reason why buyers are looking for this is because of the large extra benefits, the ancillary benefits that come from protecting forests or grasslands, where you get more biodiversity and habitat protection. Next slide. Finally, I just wanted to show you that where the market has gone. When I say it's rapidly increasing, you can see from this graphic that Ecosystem Marketplace put out in December of 2020. Look how fast it's gone up. And this isn't even 2020. This only goes out to 2019. I think when they get this year's numbers, that line may be even steeper in terms of escalating, because more and more companies are putting these net zero goals out there and are looking for how to support and kind of be a bridge, using offsets as a bridge until they actually invest in low carbon technology themselves. So reducing emissions, investing in technology, and using offsets are a big part of these net zero goals. Back to you, Verena.
Thanks. What we're going to do, I'll ask you just a couple questions, Janet, and then we'll go ahead and move to our next speaker. Thank you for that. When you go back to that slide, actually, Stephanie, if you can kind of scooch back to that slide beforehand, the previous slide. Oh, yeah, there we go. Janet, how much of that market, do you have a sense of, we have some questions coming in, do you know the percent of offsets that are geared more towards the emissions reduction or avoidance category, or specifically the removals when we go back to your chart that you had at the beginning? Do you have a sense of what the balance is?
Well, again, it's a little bit deceiving when you think about removals, and a lot of people just put afforestation and reforestation in the removals category. And I do think that's a mistake because protecting and conserving forests and grasslands also remove. So you'll see some numbers out there that, removals are small, but it really is, if you think about nature-based are a lot of, nature-based are a large portion of this. I don't know the exact number. If you go to this ecosystem marketplace, they have some stats there.
Mm-hmm. And just for people, for clarification, there's DACCS and BECCS, DACCS and BECCS. Can you clarify for our audience what that stands for?
So direct air capture, there's some pretty cool technologies out there that suck the CO2 out of the atmosphere. Then they have to do something with it. So they're going to have to store it. They can either store it underground in a saline aquifer or an abandoned reservoir, or they can, my favorite is putting it into the pores of cement. So DACCS, you can use that CO2 for a lot of different things. And then there's BECCS, which is bioenergy, like producing a fuel or producing energy with biomass, and then capturing the CO2 that comes off and putting it someplace. Could be, again, pores of cement, or it could be, underground storage. So again, you're growing trees, so you're sequestering, or you're growing biomass, or sequestering, and then you're capturing the CO2. So you get a double benefit there. BECCS.
So the first one is not a nature-based solution, but the second one is.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, it's not as cut and dry as you might think. I mean, I would put the BECCS in the nature-based solutions because I think they're it's biomass after all, but other folks wouldn't put them in that category.
Got it. Well, what we're going to do is we'll come back to some other questions that I think other panelists may also answer. But Janet, thank you. We'll come back to you after the others. And with that, I'm going to transition to Shawn. Shawn Patterson over at DTE. We'd love to learn about how a utility is approaching the use of land-based, nature-based solutions. And I think, Shawn, given DTE's net zero goal and that DTE is looking at a variety of options, both in-house and external as part of your strategy, I'd love for if you could talk about how nature-based solutions fit in as part of DTE's broader suite of approaches to reducing your own carbon footprint, and then also how you're engaging your customers in those efforts.
Oh, great. Thanks, Verena. It's a real pleasure to be a part of this conversation this afternoon. Fitting too that I'm following Janet here. BlueSource has been such an excellent partner for us in terms of educating us in the area of nature-based solutions and helping to partner on some projects that I'll talk about. And Nature Conservancy has also been a wonderful partner for us as we've tried to think about how this set of solutions fits into our emissions reductions goals. So just a bit more about DTE. We're headquartered in Detroit, Michigan, a little over 10,000 employees. We have four major business units. We have an electric utility business, and I'll talk about our emissions goals there. We have a gas utility business, and then we have a couple of non-regulated businesses, which I think are interesting in terms of how we think about the emissions reduction strategies there and these nature-based solutions. So we have a power and industrial business. A big part of that business is we do energy management for industrial companies, many of whom have their own emissions reductions goals. So we're kind of playing a partnership role in helping them figure it out. And we also have a gas midstream business. And I just want to talk about how we're thinking about biosequestration, carbon removal in each of these businesses. And I'll start with our electric business. We've been a leader in our industry in terms of making rather ambitious aspirations around emissions reductions. We have recently put a commitment out of being a net zero generator of electricity by 2050. And when you look at the pathway to get there, it's pretty easy to find the first 80% as we go through a significant reduction of coal units here over the coming decade or so. But it's that final 15 to 20% that is going to be reliant on new technologies to become commercially available. Hydrogen, perhaps, advanced renewables, advanced nuclear, carbon capture. But we certainly see in that suite of technology solutions that need to evolve and need to be available, biosequestration, nature-based solutions. We haven't made any specific declarations or firmed up any specific projects on our electric side yet, but we certainly see biosequestration as being an important arrow in our quiver to help us manage that final 15 to 20%. we're doing a lot of thinking about what that looks like now, because we need these projects to be there, a decade or more out, and you need to get those started often now in order for the offsets to be there. So there is some urgency in terms of making choices in this space, but we absolutely, as a company, have taken a position that we need to be agnostic on all technologies and all solutions, and see this as part of our pathway to net zero. In our power and industrial sector, again, this is energy management, and we're having some really interesting conversations with our customers, large industrial customers who have made their own emissions reductions statements, and for us, it's helping to manage their scope 2 emissions. And we definitely have already started conversations around projects that kind of play an intermediary to make available offsets to them to help them with their emissions reduction goals. And our gas midstream business, again, in every business we have, it's about emissions reductions first. But then there's sort of that hard to get final percent reductions. And in our gas midstream business, we're certainly going to put a lot of money into asset investment, maintenance, things of that nature. But it sure feels like a business that, again, is going to have this kind of hard to get final tail. And again, we've been exploring projects there as well. Where we've had the most activity is in our gas utility business. So this past summer, we had a pretty significant industry-leading announcement around emissions reduction goals. Whereas most gas utilities have talked about reducing emissions just within the utility, we wanted to look at the entire value stream. So we pledged to be net zero within our utility by 2050, but we also wanted to go upstream, and we made a pledge that we'd be procuring gas from net zero producers by 2050 as well. So all gas coming into our system will be from net zero producers. But if you look at the entire value stream, the biggest bulk of emissions is in our customer use of natural gas, the burner tip emissions. And so we wanted to make a dent in those emissions as well. And so through a combination of energy efficiency and also a voluntary offset program, we're hoping to take a significant chunk of emissions out for our customers. And I have a slide that shows one of the programs that we're offering to our customers. It's called our DTE Clean Vision Natural Gas Balance Program. And a big part of this, so part of it is renewable natural gas, but a big part of this is we have a project that we're working with BlueSource where we're procuring offsets and then selling them on a voluntary basis back to our customers. So for anywhere from $4 to $16 a month, customers can participate in this program. It will offset 25% to 100% of the emissions from an average home. Now, we're not making any money off of this. This is just giving our customers an opportunity to do more in terms of managing their own carbon footprint. We have a program on the electric side called My Green Power, and it's, again, a voluntary program, and it enables customers to choose how much of their energy use they want to procure from renewable sources. And we've just been blown away by the level of subscription to this program, and it's enabling us to build out renewables faster. We're just going to our customers with this program on the gas side, this natural balance program. But we expect that it's going to be very attractive. We just see a increasing demand in the marketplace to be able to do more in terms of controlling reduction of your own carbon footprint. In addition, this is a locally based program. It's again managed by BlueSource in the state of Michigan. When we get the full subscription, we'll be protecting and improving over 25,000 acres in the UP of Michigan. And this is a state like many others where its residents are very proud of the natural resources that we have. So to not only be able to have an impact in terms of mitigating climate change, but also to be helping the environment is a real win-win for our customers. So when we get to full scale here, we hope to be offsetting about 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent gases with our customers. So really innovative program. Hopefully some other companies in our industry will follow suit and give customers more of an opportunity to, like I said, help reduce their carbon footprint. So Verena, I'll stop there. We'll talk more about it here in a bit.
Get my camera back on. Yeah. Well, I'd love to learn a little bit more if you can talk about, I think what's really interesting about this particular program is that it does have the local component to it. And I think there's a lot of attention being placed on, in terms of corporate climate leadership, to be able to have an impact where the operations are, where the customers are, and then also, the co-benefits of the investments in nature-based solutions specifically. So there's a lot of different things that are happening here. And I think maybe what would be helpful, and I don't want to go too far into this direction, but I think just to give some context to our listeners, maybe explain why in the thermal space, why it is so difficult to reduce thermal sort of scope 1 emissions. And if you can talk a little bit, just for a few minutes, in terms of this carbon offset project in Michigan, and then how it also supports the development of RNG, and then we're going to kind of pivot back to the Michigan focus for a moment there. So
Yeah.
about, the challenge with thermal.
Yeah, and Verena, are you talking about the thermal in terms of the use of and housing and buildings and things of that nature?
Yeah, and I think just the fact that it's difficult to reduce thermal emissions, and so I think what's interesting about this particular project is the offsetting of within the project in Michigan, the offsetting of the emissions, but then also the support of the development of RNG through this nature-based approach.
Yeah. So yeah, we've been a leader in RNG as well, and using that as another source of offset. We've had some conversations at the state level with legislators and Department of Natural Resources, and BlueSource is partnering with them. And we see that this is a big opportunity for the state of Michigan to grow in this space and perhaps sell offsets to other markets. Again, it's a state with an abundant amount of natural resources. So a lot of activity prompted by us at the state level to see if we can't continue to expand this market. The issue for gas customers, why don't we just skip ahead and go to building electrification, housing electrification? In cold weather climates right now, those technologies are just sort of out of the money for most customers. It's a huge affordability problem. I'm sure as technology evolves, that will be certainly lessened. But in this interim time, while these technologies aren't at a commercial scale for our residential customers, for our commercial customers, for our industrial customers, we feel like this is an excellent bridge solution to offer. And again, Janet talked about how the voluntary market is really growing, and we're just trying to make that available to our customers as well.
What's been the reaction from customers or from other key stakeholders in Michigan specifically? Yeah,
so we're just engaging our customers now. So probably in 2 or 3 months, I can answer that question a little more definitively. However, at the governor's level, at the state legislature level, with our public service commission, enthusiastically received. And I think they have an attitude of whatever solutions we can bring to bear to help mitigate climate change, let's go after it. So it's been enthusiastically received, and we're just starting to sell to our customers, but we're optimistic it's going to go quickly.
And do you have a sense of this particular program is geared toward your gas customers? Can you talk a little bit about the sorts of nature-based solutions that you're also looking at to reduce your DTE's own, scope 1 emissions through the electricity side?
Yeah, that's pretty. So certainly in the gas utility side, we're going to get down to, again, that tough final percentage of emissions, and we're probably going to be engaged in projects to help offset those final emissions. On the electric side, this is where ultimately we would love to get to zero emissions, and through continued development of, as I said, hydrogen, more deployment of renewables. But to get to zero, you've got to get through net zero. And there's probably going to be a period of time here where, until those technologies are commercially available, that we're going to be investing in projects to make sure that we truly are a net zero generator.
Great. I do have one more question, then we'll kind of move on to our next panelist. What would you say when we're looking at the downstream customers represented in the goal of the 1 million tons of CO2 equivalent offset? Does that incorporate a large customer base? Is that a kind of a subset of your customer customer base, how much of your downstream customer base are you hoping to affect through your program?
No, it's a great question. And I would say two things about that. Number one, right now it's just geared toward our residential customers, but we are thinking about how do we offer something to our commercial industrial programs as well at scale. But the other side to this, Verena, is we're a company that very much believes that being able to do more in terms of mitigating climate change shouldn't just be a matter of the size of your wallet. And so we're working with, again, our regulators and our legislator to figure out ways in which we can enable our low-income customers to participate in these voluntary programs as well. The Natural Gas Balance Program, the My Green Energy Program. We want everyone, regardless of the size of their pocketbook, to feel like they're doing everything they possibly can to participate in mitigating climate change. So those are conversations we're having right now to try to figure out some creative solutions.
Mm-hmm. So kind of the intersection of equitable access,
exactly,
net zero, all coming together.
Exactly. We're trying to think about everyone
and
what they can do.
Well, we're going to come back to Shawn. I know we've got a couple questions coming in, but I want to make sure that we have all of our speakers giving time to them. And I also will note that we have two of our speakers have to dash a little early. So we're going to try and end the webinar before 2:30. So please, these questions are great that are coming in. We'll do our best to answer them. So with that, I'm going to transition now to Roberta, and she's going to talk about a different approach to nature-based solutions that is more focused on the agricultural space. So I see a lot of questions coming in about ag. And, you know, in Roberta's perspective, you know, this time on the agricultural side of the conversation, I know, and Pepsico has been great about sort of publishing and showcasing kind of where their emissions footprint is. The vast majority of it is in their supply chain or scope 3 emissions. And I think unlike DTE, which is investing in nature-based solutions that are really outside of its core business offerings, in your case, in PepsiCo's case, the land use is so central to creating the products that we, or I personally enjoy. So Roberta, can you talk to us about PepsiCo's climate goals as kind of a way to frame the conversation, and then talk about how the company's approaching reducing your greenhouse gas emissions, but you know, from an ag-based perspective?
Yeah, I'm Vice President of Sustainability for PepsiCo. So first, I suspect most folks on the call are familiar with PepsiCo. We're one of the largest food and beverage companies in the world. We have about 250,000 employees around the globe. In addition to the name over the door, Pepsi, we also own Gatorade and Tropicana. We have our Frito-Lay business is huge. We also own Quaker. So to say that we are an agricultural company at our heart would be no exaggeration. And in fact, the truth, the only thing that we sell that does not come from agriculture is bottled water. So we came out just last month, actually, with a revised and accelerated goal for climate. We doubled, actually, our existing climate target and committed to a more than 40% reduction in absolute greenhouse gas emissions across our whole value chain by 2030. And that will include a 75% reduction in scope 1 and 2 emissions. And then we committed to net zero emissions by 2040. So about 10 years ahead of what the Paris Climate Accord is looking for. So really proud of that. It's very aggressive. We have a science-based designation from SBTi for the goal. And now we go about the very difficult business of setting up our glide paths to deliver that goal. Agriculture is fully a third of our greenhouse gas footprint. It's the single largest contributor to that value chain-wide GHG footprint. So obviously, it's also a core target area for us. But I will say that delivering our reduction goal will require multiple initiatives across all parts of our value chain, you know, not just in ag. Packaging manufacture is also a huge part of our footprint. It's the second biggest chunk. And between agriculture emissions and emissions from the manufacturing of our packaging, you have more than half of our global footprint. Scope 1 and 2 emissions are just 8% of our GHG footprint. So lots of things that we have to do. Many we've started on. We've had a climate goal for the last 5 years, a scope 1, 2, and 3 absolute target. We've just doubled it last month. So if I talk about nature-based solutions in particular, I'll talk a little bit about the ag space in a minute, but I did want to call to your attention another one of our sustainability goals where we are doing almost entirely nature-based solutions to deliver it, and that's our water replenishment goal. So we have a goal to replenish 100% of the water that we use in manufacturing operations, where those manufacturing operations are in high water risk areas. So we've got about 60, starting to move up closer to 100 with an acquisition that we made last year of wholly owned production locations that we consider high water risk. And the projects that we do to deliver that replenishment goal are pretty much exclusively nature-based solutions. They're things like reforestation, wetlands remediation. So these are great projects done with some great partners around the globe. WWF, for example, in Pakistan is helping us do a wetlands rehabilitation project there. Nature Conservancy is a super important partner for us in North America and in South America. So great double dip, so to speak, between hitting one of our water goals and contributing to restoration of biodiversity and carbon sequestration, even though we are not tracking the carbon sequestration potential of those replenishment projects and banking it against our climate target. We're still highly focused on them. So that's one area of our sustainability strategy that leverages nature-based solutions. Let me move to our climate goal, and kind of in a sea of must-win battles, as we call them, for initiatives that will help us reduce GHG emissions across our value chain. What we do in ag is critically important. We have what I think is a world-class sustainable farming program at PepsiCo that's been in operation for a number of years, where we are working with farmers around the globe. We have over 40,000 farmers from whom we buy crops like potatoes for Lay's potato chips directly. So we call them our direct farmers. That are engaged in our sustainable farming program. And one of the pillars of that program is soil health. So as we all know, healthy soil stores carbon. It also stores water. So we are doing a tremendous amount of work around the globe to improve soil health on farms, because not only does healthy soil store carbon and store water, but it increases yields. So there's a strong kind of business case here to support not only PepsiCo's supply chain resiliency, but farmer livelihoods, which is pretty important to us. I'll just talk a little bit about this topic of offsets. I actually like to talk mainly about insets. And the way I define insets are, they're literally very similar, same projects as what you would consider through doing offsets, but they're projects done within our supply chain. So insetting versus offsetting outside of our supply chain. An example of this is working with farmers in our supply shed, so to speak, much like a watershed, but a supply shed, particularly where that's a commodity purchase, like, for example, corn that we use as high fructose corn syrup as a sweetener. We buy a lot of corn in the state of Illinois in the US, and we work with farmers there, along with the Illinois Corn Growers Association, to encourage the use of cover crops. We did a project there last year, or in 2019, where we have about 60 plus farmers that are in this supply shed for us for corn, some of them direct farmers, some of them indirect farmers. And over half of them participated in the program and started growing cover crops where they had not grown them before. So we banked a greenhouse gas sequestration or carbon removal for that program, but at the same time spread the message, so to speak, of the benefits of sustainable regenerative practices like growing cover crops and the benefits to the farmer of doing so. So I think Verena, I'll stop there and see where you want to take the conversation with questions.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Roberta. I think I'd like to just talk a little bit more about, what interests me is that, you have some of the, projects that are offset projects that are sort of ready for companies to purchase. And then I think in what, you're talking about with PepsiCo, there's in many ways a very hands-on way of working with your supply chain to really change the practices. Can you tell us a little bit about, and as PepsiCo has partnered with whether partnered with your suppliers or partner with other suppliers to go further up the supply chain, can you tell us a little bit about that experience and maybe what some of the challenges are, so that our audience can better understand just, I think, the complexity in working upstream with your supply chain in a hands-on kind of way?
Yeah, I think this may not quite get to your question, but one of the challenges that we're working through right now is actually not with the boots on the ground, getting our supply chain engaged. It's accounting, GHG accounting in terms of offsets and insets. So wow. This is something I feel strongly about today. So we have a science-based target validated through SBTi to reduce GHG emissions by 40%, as I said, by 2030. So that's our reduction commitment. And then our removal commitment is net zero emissions by 2040. Offsets do not count toward a reduction target. And so the incentive for us to do offset projects is, in terms of trying to achieve our carbon goal, is just not there. This is why I love insetting so much, because we believe that insetting can and should count toward a reduction target, especially insets that are reduction insets, as we recall from Janet's first infographic. So one of the things that I'm doing now is talking to some of our NGO partners who are involved in this space of defining the rules of the road in terms of accounting, about how important it is to give companies like PepsiCo the flexibility to do nature-based solutions like insets and maybe even offsets, give us the incentive to do them by allowing them to count against our targets. Because frankly, in reality, that's one way that I'm able to sell into the company the need to do a project. If it counts against the business unit greenhouse gas target, which everybody in PepsiCo is accountable for this target, then I'm more likely to convince them to find room for it on their room for the cost in their budget and on their balance sheet. So I'm sure that is not what you had intended, Verena, but.
Well, but I think and I think just for the audience, we have both very technical folks on the call. We also have some folks that are not. So I think I'll try to bring it up to a higher level for those that might not be as deep in the weeds. But In other words, can you maybe just explain again the difference in an inset and an offset, and the way that the way that it would show up, in the way that how a company can transparently demonstrate that it is on a path to meeting its emissions reduction goals?
Yeah, so I'll again use the ag example because it's top of mind for us. If we do a project with corn growers in Illinois to sequester carbon, like with the cover crops example, that is an inset project. So it's removing carbon by soil sequestration. It's an inset project because though corn growers in Illinois are part of our supply chain, we buy corn from this geographic area within the state of Illinois. Mm-hmm. If we were doing that same project with corn growers in Texas, making it up, that would be an offset project because it's not part of our supply chain, and hence we would not be able to count it toward our reduction goal.
I see.
So unlikely to do it, much likely to do insets. So just a question of very similar projects, just geographically where you do them. And
going back to, and I see some questions coming in. So going back to the kind of what Janet had talked about earlier in terms of sort of the level of quality and verification of a project. When you have a project like the example of the corn growers in Illinois, does that need to sort of be, even if it's an inset, does it need to be sort of banked according to all of the, as an official sort of offset within your supply chain, or does it, as long as it follows the same principles of what you would see in a normal offset project, does that sort of count as part of your solution? And the reason I'm bringing this up for those that are listening in is because companies have a really difficult time in some sectors really being able to sort of demonstrate emissions reductions in their supply chain, where supply chain is part of their greenhouse gas reduction target.
Yeah, it's a great question, Verena, and unclear is my answer. Again, rules are not clear on that. They're also, just the guidance is we're really desperate for confirmed guidance in this area. What's the level of verification required? Mm-hmm. Who's accountable, or who's the credible body that would provide that verification? For soil sequestration and ag, it's even more complicated because the last thing you want is to be required to put soil carbon probes in every meter of every field and every acre that you're doing cover crops on. It would be horribly cost prohibitive to do that level of measurement in the soil. So this is a field that is developing as we speak, like a lot of what we do in sustainability. We're on the bleeding edge of creating new science here.
Right. And one question before we move on to Kelley to talk about kind of how companies can kind of engage in these international markets. Can you provide some other examples of some of the nature-based solutions that are in the agricultural supply chain that PepsiCo is dealing with? Soil sequestration is one of them, but we've got a couple questions coming in with things like, reducing methane from ruminants, or from, switchgrass, or from other kinds of agricultural solutions. Can you give us a little bit of some other examples?
Yeah, there's in the palm oil supply chain, there's some good programs going on where there's reforestation and kind of restoration of land that had been deforested. That is another, again, within our supply shed. There's methane capture in rice paddies. That's another very interesting project that's going on. Those are the two that I can think of off the top of my head, Verena.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We might come back to you if we have time. Thank you very much, Roberta, for that rundown. And we apologize again for the slide. The one on here is correct. So with that, we're going to turn over to Kelley Kizzier. And Kelley has been involved in the climate policy for a long time. And we're going to have her discuss the role of companies in helping to support the international voluntary carbon markets. But Kelley, as you've seen this issue from a variety of angles, and including efforts at the international level to create an international system where the emissions reductions activities in one region, like the protection of a forest, could be used and accounted for by another entity. And for those of you that don't know Kelley, she's very active under the Paris Agreement on Article 6. That's an entirely different webinar, but nonetheless, we welcome her expertise here. And really what we want to focus on is, as businesses are increasingly turning to natural solutions and the voluntary carbon markets to meet their climate goals, as we're seeing with different examples from DTE and with PepsiCo. At the end of 2020, last year, EDF put out a report called Mobilizing Voluntary Carbon Markets to Drive Climate Action. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you see these markets connecting to efforts, the broader conversation under the Paris Agreement?
Sure. So as we've heard, demand for carbon credits is recently booming. And this is in large part driven by the uptick in corporate climate commitments and more recently in net zero commitments. It's also true that the carbon offsetting scheme for international aviation, I rarely have to say that all out, CORSIA, is expected to drive demand from 2024 onwards when the aviation industry recovers from the hit it took during COVID-19. And in fact, last year, ICAO, sorry, another acronym, the International Civil Aviation Organization, approved the first jurisdictional forest programs for eligibility under CORSIA. So nature-based solutions will certainly be used under a UN scheme to offset the growth in emissions from aviation. And as Janet mentioned, all these countries and companies are taking net zero or carbon neutrality targets. I saw there was a question, we can go into the difference of those. But this is because the science is clear, right? To avoid dangerous climate change, we have to reduce GHG emissions to net zero by around the middle of the century. Some people say the middle of the century, but the scenarios say by around the middle of the century, and residual CO2 emissions have to be balanced by removals. Put a different way, the tap is still on and the bath is full. So to achieve net zero, we have to reduce emissions and we have to enhance removals. The great thing about nature-based solutions is they provide a path for both of those things, for both reductions and removals. And they provide us with a way to address our most urgent climate challenges. If we don't protect our tropical forests, for instance, in the next decade, it really is game over. The global environment will be forever altered. And I'm not sure we can find a path to 2 degrees or even 1.5 degrees if we fail. The thing is, we can't solve the climate problem or address these urgencies with public finance alone. So we have to be able to channel the much greater flows that private capital can provide into things like jurisdictional approaches for forest protection. And to do that, we need carbon markets. So just to give you some numbers behind that, our modeling shows that carbon markets can translate into cost savings of $250 billion per year by 2030. And if these savings are translated into enhanced ambition, we can get 50% more abatement by 2030. If we include nature-based solutions into this equation, we get 100% more abatement at the same cost. So with carbon markets and nature-based solutions, we can nearly double the ambition that we're seeing under the Paris Agreement, which is hugely important because right now we're on a path to 3 degrees and dangerous climate change. It's also important to note the Paris Agreement and the impact it has in changing the landscape. Unfortunately, and you're right, this is a topic for another webinar, so I'll just get past it quickly. The Paris Agreement rules for carbon markets under Article 6 are not yet finalized. We've made a lot of progress and only a handful of issues remain. And I have to hope that these remaining issues are resolved at COP26 and we get a carbon market rule book under the Paris Agreement. Of course, there are questions about whether or not COP26 will happen because of the pandemic. In the meantime, the Paris Agreement does not restrict carbon market trading in the absence of the rules. So we can continue now. As you mentioned, we recently ran a process called Mobilizing Voluntary Carbon Markets to Drive Climate Action in order to develop a set of recommendations to incentivize credible and Paris-aligned climate action by companies. The process included, well, Janet was in the process, but the process included major NGOs, about 10 or 12 companies, all of the major standard setting bodies or registries, as we referred to earlier, and other key voluntary market stakeholders. The recommendations came out in December, and during the sort of 10-month period that we ran this project, we had more than 90% attendance from our 40-odd steering committee over the course of our 6 meetings. As it turns out, this is a very live issue and folks are definitely interested. Throughout this process and in countless bilateral discussions with all of our participants, we looked into the role of high quality carbon credits in corporate mitigation strategies, options for aligning the transparency and accounting of voluntary markets with emerging Paris Agreement rules, and the rules being elaborated in our CORSIA, at measures that the standard setting bodies and other stakeholders can take to ensure the quality of the outcomes, and ways to enhance transparency of the whole system. Ultimately, we concluded that high quality credits can play a significant role in net zero strategies. So to address the previous concerns, we concluded that these can and should count in the right circumstances. We also recommend that investment in the most urgent opportunities, and this definitely for us includes jurisdictional tropical forest protection, can't be halted while we're waiting for the international rules to merge. And as an aside, tropical forests are only in the supply chain of a limited number of companies. So we would worry about guidance that would dissuade crucial investment in this area. So I understand the insetting and the benefits that it provides in terms of mitigation hierarchy, but it may be disincentivizing some of the most urgent things we need to do for climate change. We also concluded that during the transition period, while we're waiting for the international rules, carbon market participants should work to improve quality, transparency, and accounting systems, both for the companies, but also with the countries that host these carbon market activities, so that their capacity is improved and that the transparency is improved across the entire system. That initiative was just a beginning, and we need to do a lot more work to get consensus on what good looks like in terms of accounting for corporate strategies, in terms of Paris alignment, in terms of some of the quality criteria. But in the end, nature-based solutions can provide up to a third of what we need by 2030 to get the world on track to stabilizing the climate. And we're going to need durable economic incentives to get there. So it's one of our key focuses over the next year and probably in the years after that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelley. I do have 1 or 2 follow-up questions for you, and then we'll open it up to everybody. I'll have we'll shift the discussion to a policy conversation in just a moment. Kelley, can you talk a little bit about CORSIA and some of the kind of the lessons learned from CORSIA in a good way? Sort of what are sort of transferable wins or lessons learned that potentially can inform how other sectors approach using nature-based solutions to mitigate their greenhouse gas emissions?
Sorry, can't come off mute. It's like the theme of this last year. Yeah, I think, CORSIA established a process for review of programs and activities to determine eligibility. They started with a set of emission unit criteria, a clearly defined set of criteria, and then a set of guidance about how to apply this criteria in the evaluation of programs. Then they opened up windows where basically specific programs, registries offset programs could apply for eligibility. And then they did a really rigorous review of these and came out with a transparent set of recommendations about why some were eligible and why some weren't. And I think it was unusually transparent for a UN process, and provided a lot of insight into that question of what good looks like. Of course, it was a UN process, so there are always different political concerns, but I think in general, it was a rigorous approach to determining eligibility for these offsets.
All right, I'd like to bring back the panelists. Thank you, Kelley, for that explanation. To focus a little bit on the policy conversation, and I think we'll go back in the same order as before. I'll start with Janet and Shawn, then Roberta, and end with you, Kelley. But I'm curious, and I think maybe taking a U.S. lens to start with. When we talk about, and Janet, you mentioned at the beginning, the need for policy solutions to kind of move nature-based solutions along. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Like, how can policy changes help accelerate the uptake? And how can it potentially overcome some of the barriers that still exist to creating robust markets?
That's a hard question because it's not an easy one. I mean, there's a lot of policy that can be helpful. I mean, a price on carbon that incentivized investment across the economy would be a good first step, but we'll see where that goes. In California, they have an emissions trading system that allows offsets to be used. South Africa has a carbon tax that allows offsets to be used. I personally like offsets. I wouldn't have moved to BlueSource otherwise, obviously. But I like it because it puts a price on an environmental amenity that wouldn't otherwise have a price. So with that price, you get innovation, you get investment. And it's not the only thing that should be done. You do need policy. But there's some things like CAFE standards that actually will move the transportation sector further than a price would. So policy is essential. Voluntary actions are a complement to that. They're not the only thing, but they're a way to mobilize, if you will, private investment in a way that also complements the policy agenda that should also motivate investment. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. It's two parts of a coin. It's not one or the other. It's both.
I'm going to actually change order and pivot to Roberta really quickly, just building off of what Janet said, and then go to Shawn. Roberta, I'm wondering, as we think about the work that you're doing in the agricultural space, and I think Janet mentioned the California market, I'm thinking about, to what extent, is creating an ag-based offsets program here in the U.S. Would that help PepsiCo? Can you talk a little bit about some policies that you think would be most helpful in moving the needle along further when you're looking at it from maybe an insetting perspective in your supply chain?
Yeah, short answer, Verena, is yes, it would help us. And I think to last year, the Growing Climate Solutions Act that was introduced, that was cool. It basically provided financial incentives for farmers and foresters to employ climate smart, practices, because it would have enabled them to bank them as carbon credits and sell them. So we vocally advocated for that. The way that this will be preaching to the choir here, but if PepsiCo eliminated its greenhouse gas emissions from its entire value chain tomorrow, it would have no effect on the climate crisis. We need everybody to do their fair share and probably even more at the same time. And really the most effective way to force everyone to do their fair share, because it will require forcing, is through policy and regulation. So carbon price is another good example. PepsiCo is one of the founding members of the Climate Leadership Council that advocates for a bipartisan group that advocates for setting a price on carbon in the US. We're advocating positively for the EU Green Deal. So it's very important to us and a part of our climate pillar.
Okay, thank you. So Shawn, I'll turn to you. If you want to speak broadly about the role of policy when you're thinking about, I know DT is thinking about its broader portfolio, but when we think about the role of nature-based solutions, given your experience, particularly with this Michigan project or other projects that you're thinking about to reduce your carbon footprint, where and how can policy help advance and simplify and accelerate the use of nature-based solutions from your perspective?
Yeah. It's a great question. I think for us and probably everybody else is thinking about getting engaged with projects. It's about confidence and durability. I think Janet laid out a great list. We look at the different projects and offset markets out there. It's about real, it's about permanence, it's about being verifiable, enforceable, additional, and making sure that whatever policy really stems and ensures that those principles are in place is critical to us. So that's just how we engage. But I think that any policy that puts those principles in mind will create that durable approach that we need. As we look at policy and particularly the power sector, we're a little bit disappointed to see that some of the leading clean energy standard concepts are silent on the role of nature-based solutions and offsets. And certainly as we advocate at industry level, we would like to see that be dealt with. And that would certainly enable us to push the accelerator even more so on these projects. And I would just broaden that to, legislation overall as it relates to achieving economy-wide net zero aspirations, that we'd really like to see voice to this. So it moves beyond the voluntary market that we talked about, which obviously has some legs to it. But I know as a company, we'd be doing a lot more, a lot sooner with that confidence and durability that only comes through good policy, good legislation. So that's our view.
And I think I'm looking at the questions. We have a ton of questions coming in. So for those that are asking them, I'll do my best to kind of look at a few more that are overarching. And I think for those that have very specific questions for our speakers, please email us and we'll find a way to get you the answers. But maybe to pivot to Kelley here, one of the questions that we come in is when do the voluntary and the mandatory markets collide? And the reason I'm kind of asking this is because as countries or as states might have requirements, and Shawn, I'm kind of building off of what you're saying, if there were to be a clean energy standard that were to allow for nature-based solutions or offsets as part of that, let's just say that were to happen, where do the mandatory requirements at the corporate level or at the state level or at the country level interact with the voluntary markets that are needed to kind of continue to spur demand and continue to spur project development? Kelley, I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to how you see those two things playing out next to each other.
Yeah, I mean, I think Roberta already answered this quite nicely. Like, I think that the voluntary action we're seeing and allowing those leading companies to really take the lead, which will benefit them in the future, is great, and it's a great start. But eventually we're going to need policy to cover these emissions if we're going to get to where we need to be, because even the laggards need to be covered by an emission reduction policy. And for those that have started early, they're going to have a first mover advantage in that, which is awesome. But we're not going to get to 2 degrees, much less 1.5, on the back of voluntary action alone. We are going to have policy. So how these two, I mean, there is already some convergence. So Corsia, for instance, allowed the use of what used to be voluntary credits for aviation emissions in a hard to abate sector, in recognition that that hard to abate sector needed to use offsets to deal with its emissions growth while we're waiting for technologies like sustainable aviation fuel to come online. Because that'll be the eventual solution, but we needed a stopgap. And I think that's really a huge part of it. I think I saw a question about how jurisdictional approaches would work. Yes, they involve interaction with government, with local government, potentially federal government, necessarily. So it's absolutely right that you have to be involved with government to do a jurisdictional scale approach, but projects can be nested up into a jurisdictional scale. So they're not at odds with each other. They're complementary to each other. I saw a question on corresponding adjustments, so please contact me offline. I won't open that discussion here. I'm looking at Janet, and I can share the study that we had with those numbers I gave with the 250 billion. I should say, just for transparency, that IETA also did a very similar modeling exercise with Jay Edmonds from the University of Maryland, and the results were very much the same. So, and Jay is an IPCC modeler, so I think they can be trusted. I'll send both of those to you, Verena, and have you distribute them. Thank you. And hi, Thomas Ford.
And just for folks, Roberta had to drop off to leave at 2:15. So we'll take another. I'll have two more final questions for our panelists, and thank you for all those that are asking. I think one question that is interesting and that we see a lot of is this discussion of equity and local engagement and climate justice. That's very much at the forefront of discussions, and I think it dovetails, Shawn, to what we said earlier about corporations being increasingly looking to do things at a more local level. I'm wondering if maybe Janet, you might have some insights here. What are some sort of lessons learned or best practices or practices in general that we're seeing in terms of engaging with the local community to create these kind of programs and projects. So to rephrase that, if companies want to be able to think more locally and get involved more locally, what are some of the things that, that elements that need to be in place to do a project successfully?
Well, Shawn mentioned doing projects in Michigan. And I would say a lot of, our partners in this space are looking for projects that have localized benefits, whether that's about creating more forest cover, creating jobs. We have a couple projects, for example, where we're partnering with the First Nations or tribal governments, and those communities directly benefit from the carbon value of the forest in their region. So that's that's a prime example. But also another one is, getting people out there to see these forests. I know that sounds kind of trite, but getting schools and getting students out there to experience nature, that's important. And a lot of the projects that we develop also bring students in. And I actually think people need to see and feel these things to really value them. So I think there's a lot of different ways that local value can be had. I think our First Nations projects and tribal government projects are prime examples of environmental justice.
Kelley or Shawn, do you have anything to add to that?
Well, Verena, I might just make it even a little more local, though I don't think this is a massive part of the emissions abatement. But one of the things we've been really interested in, headquartered in Detroit, and we've got a number of EJ communities around us. Urban forestation is something that we're interested in exploring further. And I think that it engages our customers even more locally. It engages these communities that feel like issues of equity haven't always been available to them. And you talked about some of the thermal pollution issues. It helps in that regard as well. So kind of going back to that policy question, environmental justice has become a big part of the climate change conversation. And if there's a way of incenting more of nature-based solutions at an urban level, we think that would be wonderful and go a long way to mitigate some of the environmental justice issues that we see in our communities.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would just add, we work really closely with indigenous communities, in particular in Brazil, to make sure that the design of these programs takes into account that really crucial population. And in terms of the environmental justice issues, I agree, like climate is a global problem, but local pollution is not. And so, you can't address any of this in a vacuum. You have to make sure that you have a holistic approach to these environmental projections so that you're not accidentally increasing local air pollution when you're addressing climate. And somebody asked, it's the same, we need all the tools in the box. This is not an easy answer. So would I prioritize tropical forest protection over removals? I think both are excellent. We need to drive down the cost of removal technology if we're going to get to net zero. But if every company took the same policy to only focus on removals, it would be a disaster, right? We need a spread portfolio. We need to address the most urgent things. And so a company's policy is great, but a universal policy, a one size fits all, is not going to get us there.
Okay. One question maybe, Kelley, for you is, we have a question coming in that says, do we feel that we can only motivate carbon storage through carbon markets and private companies, or are there other ways that can be done? I mean, obviously, but.
I think Janet wants to answer here too. I think, as with any of this, carbon markets are part of the solution, but there is no silver bullet, right? We need a suite of policies plus voluntary action, plus anything investment frameworks that drive ambition. We're going to need to do it all to tackle climate change. So no, carbon markets don't get us all the way there, but they can help get the finance flowing.
Cost is a big thing. And if you look at carbon removal, the mechanical carbon removals, costs have come down dramatically. But the change to the tax code 45Q a couple of years ago has done an amazing job of spurring, direct air capture, biologic energy with carbon storage, and just carbon capture and storage on industrials. But that in and of itself is not even enough. There are other things that need to be done to actually ensure that those costs continue to drop, and that there's there's a value proposition for investing in that kind of new and unproven technology. I mean, we have been doing carbon capture and storage for enhanced oil recovery for 45 plus years at this point, so it is definitely not new. But direct air capture, that is new, and driving those costs down is really important. And so other policies, yes, 45Q extending the date of commence construction. I mean, there are all kinds of pieces of the carbon capture and storage that need additional policy.
And we have examples of where we've successfully driven down the cost of these technologies. I mean, wind is a great success story. Ironically, it means it's not considered to be large grid connected wind is no longer considered to be additional as an offset. That's because we drove the costs down to the point where it wouldn't be.
Yeah, and I would just add solar too. You know, 5-10 years ago in the state of Michigan, we didn't see much solar at all, and it's now becoming one of the preferred renewable generation sources. So you're absolutely right, Kelley. Economies of scale matter.
So I want to have each of the we're gonna end with one big double question for each panelist here. We talked about clean energy standard, we talked about carbon pricing, but can you name one market or policy incentive that we need that you'd like to see enacted in the next 2 years? And then in addition, what would be one corporate initiative that you hope becomes mainstream?
That's a big question, I guess. Parochially, I'd like to get to a very reasonable and achievable and aspirational clean energy standard that would help immensely in our business. And I'm really proud of DTE and the fact that our leaders and our employees have come up with some really creative programs to enable our customers to engage in mitigation of climate change on a voluntary basis as well, not just being beholden to what our regulators have told us, but also finding ways to enable those that can and want to do more to be able to do it. So I hope that we see that move beyond into many other companies in our industry.
Kelley or Janet?
You know, I love the DTE is engaging with its customers. And I can tell, a webinar like this, climate is important, everybody should be taking action. But my utility sending me an email saying, oh, by the way, climate's important, we're doing stuff and you should too. I think that is pretty cool. So I'd like to see more of that go mainstream. I would like to see all companies engaging with their customers, telling them, you too should be taking action on climate change. And these are the things you could do about it. So that's, you asked, what I'd like to see go mainstream. That's one of the things I'd like to see go mainstream.
And is there one policy that you'd like to see enacted in the next 2 to 5 years? Besides a carbon price?
Okay, I'll skip that one. To really scale the voluntary carbon markets, we need greater transparency. People need to understand what they are. They need to understand what makes a good offset, and they need to understand what prices are out there. Right now, it's a pretty opaque market. So I'd like to see more transparency within that. And I think government can do some things to help with that transparency.
Kelley, what are your thoughts?
Well, Janet stole my transparency answers. Thanks for that. No, I agree. I mean, I agree that transparency and accountability framework for all this company action can really separate the wheat from the chaff and clear some of this confusion. I think that's hugely important. And then in terms of what I'd like to see, I will have to go back to the Paris Agreement, because why wouldn't I? I would really like to see all countries take a target in line with net zero by mid-century. And I think that the only way that ambition can be achieved is if we find cost savings, right? We've delayed climate action so long that it's starting to get very expensive. So if we don't grab onto these efficiencies, we're never going to get there. And I think carbon markets provide a really important efficiency.
All right. Well, with that, thank you very much to our panelists for joining us today. And thank you to all of you who asked a lot of really great questions, and we will do our best to try to answer those that that really want their questions answered. So thank you again to Kelley, to Janet, to Shawn, and in absentia to Roberta for joining us. This webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. And with that, thanks a lot. Webinar is over.